So what I want to do today is play around with the ancient sources for Eumachia. So part of my purpose of doing this is, I suppose, really to help you in terms of how you're looking at your own learning in terms of classical studies modules, but also to be a bit of fun. But in terms of looking at classical studies modules, it's about how you can sort of play around with sources. And the inspiration for this talk really came from a former student of mine. She was doing this a dissertation, and I've done talks in Pompeii before, and I thought it'd be nice to actually do about a bit of a personality from there. And the more I sort of dug into it, the more I got interested in it, and more I want to explore more. So hence you'll find it's probably quite a number of slides. So without further ado, let's go and have a look at Eumachia. Um, yeah. So I think in some ways it sounds a little bit dismissive, but everything that you really want to know about Eumachia is included in this inscription. And you can see the translation there. So what I want to do is to focus on Eumachia's name. So when I started reading about this, and I know when it's my poor student, when she was studying this, it came up with the statement that Eumachia was Greek. And I thought, okay, what's the evidence for that? And this is something, that I wasn't aware of. So I had to go and dig around a little bit to try and find out about whether she had a Greek origin. Because sometimes when you're looking at personalities in Pompeii or characters in Pompeii, they'll get these statements that are continued and perpetuated through modern scholarship, but aren't necessarily connected to direct ancient sources. So I'm expressing my limitations here, and I didn't know about how to look up this term in Greek. So I spoke to my boss who does Greek, and this has sort of really come together from what she's helped me with. And Eumachia is in fact Greek, and it comes from the meaning of direct English translation of it, excellence in fighting or valor. So why is this relevant? Well, the main aspect as to why this is relevant is that when we look at Pompeii, often we'll think about this as a Roman town, which is a Roman town, but it's made up of a collective group of peoples, and one of those peoples that were around in Campania were the Greeks. And the other reason why I think it's significant is sometimes you'll see references to Eumachia coming from a slave background, and I think this is highly unlikely. The reason being is the name Eumachia actually does come from the area of Campania for at least the 3rd and 2nd century BC. There is a gentleman called Eumachius of Napoli, and he wrote a history of Hannibal. There's a few fragments of his work, and this is again dating back to the 3rd century BC. So it's very likely that the Eumachi family, the Eumachia genus, came from a Greek Campanian origin. And as they've been there for a long time, it's highly unlikely that they would have been slaves. Certainly, they wouldn't have been slaves by the time they got the Pompeii gets taken over and colonized by the force of Sulla. So it is evidence, at least, of one of the more traditional families in the area of Campania continuing and existing through the so-called colonization of Pompeii. And again, that's one of the interesting things when you're looking at the sort of elite of Pompeii. It's not that they got completely wiped out. There are sort of vestiges of this that seem to survive through the colonial period in Pompeii into at least the Augustan period. So this is why Eumachia as an individual, and she's one of the more interesting characters. The other reason why she's interesting is because she is female. But before I start doing that, let's have a look a little bit about her background. So Eumachia is the daughter of Lucius. Now Lucius Eumachius, seems to have been an individual that was involved in the pottery industry or the clay industry. I'm going to show my ignorance here, but you'll find that there are a number of references on amphorae, and these amphorae have been found in the likes of Carthage and Spain and the likes of Ostia that refer to Lucius Eumachius. The other thing is interesting. It's not just that he was interested in amphorae. He also made tile stamps or tiles. He put stamps on the tiles. That's technically what I should say. And there's evidence for this from the Villa Regina, just outside Pompeii. But I've also read that some of the bricks that are used in some of the tombs outside Pompeii do have his stamp. So it's not just the stamp of Lucius Eumachius, but we also have Lucius Eumachius Erassus, which is probably a freed individual. The last name there was suggests that he comes from a slave background and was adopted into the Eumachi family. So this is possibly suggested as to where the Eumachia wealth came from. But beyond that, it's very difficult to find direct evidence of this. But no, certainly the name Eumachia is something that exists in the area. There is another Eumachia that exists, and this is a guy called Lucius Eumachius Vascus. Now, he's what his connection is to Eumachia, I don't know. But he was an aedile in Pompeii, which is one of the magistrates in Pompeii in AD 31 to 32. So it's possible, I suppose, that he might have been a brother of Eumachia, but beyond this, I don't know what it is. It's just that they have the shared name of Eumachius. And this is inscription that was found in this house here. The house itself, it probably doesn't make much sense to you, but you can see that his name is not really the most significant part there. You can see it's very much down at the bottom part of the inscription. That's one of the things when you're looking at inscriptions, it's good to actually see the original, so you get an idea as to what is the emphasis in terms of the size of the lettering. So this was commemorating some sort of event in this household. And this house, why I think it's interesting, is it's quite close to the Edificio di Eumachia, which is the building of Eumachia, and quite close to the Forum. So if there is a connection there, possible, I don't know, but I just think it's quite interesting that we have evidence for the Eumachia family quite close to Eumachia's building. But probably of a later date. Now, there is a lot of ambiguity in relation to the date of the Eumachia building, which I'll talk about a little bit later on. So he's also mentioned in this inscription, and unfortunately, this inscription, I don't have an image of what it actually looks like or where it's been preserved, but found this is much I can find of it, is referring to a Lucius Eumachia. But whether it's Vasquez, I don't know, but you can see it's been reconstructed as that. But not much information in relation to it. And why I thought that was interesting, why I wanted to highlight that to you, is that it's located in the Marcellum, which is the market area, which is just a little bit further north of the building I just showed you, certainly further north than the Eumachia building, but quite close to Forum area. So the name Eumachia, or Eumachia, does seem to at least exist in three inscriptions, or not three inscriptions, it's more than that, in this three inscriptions referring to individuals in this sort of area, which I thought was quite interesting. So if we move beyond that and moving further to what it says here is her son, Marcus Numerius Fronto, it's highly likely that this is also the name of her husband or person that she married. So what is the evidence for this? Now, this is something I have to admit I found really frustrating. It's trying to find out exactly where this was found in Pompeii. The information it does provide is interesting because it refers to him as being a magistrate in AD 3. And beyond that, I don't know, as I said to you, exactly where it was found, but it's a significant piece of information because the suggestion is that maybe he passed away at some stage and leaving Eumachia on her own with her son, and hence this is where she becomes a dominant individual, a dominant figure in the Pompeian society and ultimately Pompeian urban landscape, which I'll talk about a little bit later on. So it's a little bit of a mystery in relation to her husband and what happened to him, and various other little stories are made up about that. Because the emphasis of this inscription is on her son rather than her husband, and hence this is where the suggestion is that her husband passed away at some stage. Moving to Eumachia herself and her as an individual, and perhaps starting to say why is she a significant individual, it refers to her position that she wants to emphasize in this inscription as being a public priestess. Now, what does that mean in terms of public priestess? And again, that's quite frustrating. And it doesn't provide much information in relation to that. But there are two sort of main priestess positions in Pompeian society. One is to Venus, and the other one is to Ceres. So, but the only one that never refers to his position, or rarely refers to his position, is that of Venus. So most of the suggestion is that Eumachia was a public priestess and a priestess of Venus. So if we move to having a look at where this temple site is. But the important point I want to make in relation to that is that this is an individual that would have been elected by the town council. So she clearly comes from an elite members of an elite family and had sufficient influence and sufficient position within society, and that she gets elected to this position. As I said, it is a public position. So the Temple of Venus is perhaps one of the most significant temples in Pompeii. And you can see from these various reconstructions about, how decorated it was. But what's quite interesting, it just follows the traditional Roman temple. It's surrounded by a three-sided portico, which I think, is personally interesting. This is how it looks like today. And it's very much a dominant position in Pompeii and the Pompeian landscape, not necessarily for the town itself, but as ships would have been going by, they certainly would have seen this very elaborate and ornate temple. And here's this where it's located. And you can see sort of the square area or the rectangular area behind being the Roman Forum and the Eumachia building located quite close to that. Now, what I've tried to do with this image here is give you an indication as to, how high this is in terms of in the landscape overall. But, it is a prominent position in the sort of townscape or landscape of Pompeii. Again, just trying to give you an indication as to, how high it is in terms of placement. And this is where, if you can imagine if people are approaching Pompeii from the sort of sea area, they would have been very impressed with this lavish temple up on the hilltop. So what is the connection with this? And again, this is one of those sort of interesting things that sort of pops up when you're sort of scurrying around trying to find bits of information, that this is a fragment that was found in the 1960s, which unfortunately, doesn't seem to have been recorded in the CILs, which is, massive corpus of Latin inscriptions, but this refers to Eumachia, daughter of Lucius, set up this statue, and this is supposed to come from the actual site of the Temple of Venus. So this would sort of reaffirms this sort of idea and concept that maybe Eumachia was a priestess Venus. So what that makes that sort of significant is I think it's quite not just the antiquity of this temple, it seems to be the main temple, but certainly when Pompeii becomes a colony, because of Sulla's sort of patron deity was Venus, and this eventually evolves and dominates into not just Venus, but Venus on Pompeii. So she is part of that sort of dynamics. So it's not just part of the dynamics of one of the elite families of Pompeii, but certainly part of the ritual sort of aspects of Pompeii as well. So that's the Temple of Venus, located behind the Basilica, quite close to Porta Marina, which I'll talk about in a little bit too, but I just want to point that out at the beginning. The Temple of Venus, just again to try and illustrate the importance and significance of this, based really upon, its positioning, but also the amount of sort of um, meters squared, so to speak, the area in which it takes over the landscape of Pompeii. You can see it's fairly large. The next sort of temple in competition with that would be the triangular temple, which is sort of, if you can see the figure 7, you can see it's located over there. Yeah, admittedly, it's a little bit away from the forum area itself, but still quite close. And you can see most of the temple buildings are located quite close to the forum. The largest one on the forum area is the Temple of Apollo, but it's still the fact that the important point about in terms of the Temple of Venus is, it's probably its antiquity, a bit like this temple, the temples on the triangular form, also very old temple in existence there. But again, the tradition I've talked to you about, the Eumachia, have been part of that tradition in the area for many centuries. It's also the fact that the Temple of Venus also seems to have that great antiquity in terms of lineage that Eumachia also has. So this just trying to give an indication as to how close the Temple of Venus is to the building of Eumachia. So again, I've been playing around with Google Earth, so I thought this was a nice image. So again, just trying to give it an impression of that, but you can see that they are very closely related to each other. So one of the difficulties when I'm talking about when I start moving on to looking at the Eumachia building is that Pompeii did suffer an earthquake in AD 62. At least we have evidence for that. It probably had other sorts of, because, obviously imagine, there's an awful lot of volcanic activity or seismic activity taking place, but certainly the earthquake of AD 62 during the reign of Nero was very significant, and as a result, it was quite a lot of destruction. Why I want to mention the point about destruction is it does make it quite difficult in terms of dating aspects in relation not just to the Eumachia building but other structures around. But I'm not going to go into too much detail about that. I'm not going to try and pretend that I don't want to confuse you. It's really because I confuse myself. But I'm going to talk to you about the building in general and aspects in relation to that. So I'm going to sort of ignore some of these sort of temporal elements and the reconstruction elements, but try to give an impression of other ways of sort of looking at this, trying to build up that picture of Eumachia as an individual and her role within society. So clearly, Eumachia was an important member of society and she gains the position of a public priestess. Now, the site in which the building of Eumachia is built on is been taken over. Originally, this was a place of not just shops, but also private dwellings. So Eumachia, as an individual, or maybe family before that, but I would seem to think that this is her as her idea, that she's able to build buy up this building plot and set up her own Eumachia building. So whether she owned all these sites individually, or she took it over in one sort of foul swoop, but she was able to take over a whole block of an insula of Pompeii and knock down and destroy these buildings and set up her own building there. We do have an indication as to, they have excavated around the portico, around the forums. We do know that there were shops that existed beforehand. We're able to expand that a little bit further about the buildings. But this seems to have been her buying up this land, which becomes her own land, and she had sufficient wealth to take over that block, as I said, to and build her own building. And this, I think, is, so it's not just about her being an important player within society as an individual, but also shows the great wealth that she had. Again, just an indication as to these shops. Now, the forum area itself would have been a prime location. So, again, that further illustrates the point that about her wealth that she has. So this is just looking at the Eumachia building from the front, and we can see, it's quite an impressive structure. There's a nice portico in front, which the columns in front, which will have an inscription above that. The building itself, as said to you, takes over a whole block, but you can see it had to evolve and develop within this area. So in some ways that explains why it's a little bit odd in terms of when you see it going straight in from the forum area itself, it looks very sort of geometric and symmetrical. But when you actually look at the plan, you can see that it's been skewed a little bit in terms of trying to make the town sort of insula fit into a nice facade. So they have the straightening out in terms of the forum area itself. So this is I've already mentioned to you a little bit about the colonnade that's in front of the structure, the decorative aspects of that. And much of this has obviously been reconstructed, but if you have a look at it, you can see, looking at the top part on top of the columns and pillars, you can see some writing above that. And that's really what I want to focus on. That. So you can see there's very sort of neat, elaborate, and very striking engravings here in terms of an inscription. Now, I'm assuming that this inscription would have been painted in a red color, so it would have been fairly obvious for people to see. But this seems to be the only area in the forum that seems to have an inscription, a sort of strip inscription across the columns, which is marking the Eumachia building. Just again, just some nice illustrations of that. These are some of the ones before they're been put back up. And this is the actual inscription. Now, for those of you that spent a bit of time reading the inscription I showed you a bit earlier on, it's a repeat of the inscription I've just showed you. But you can see that there's some elements that are missing from that. So when this was originally found, they wouldn't have known this was the Eumachia building because the word Eumachia was lost. So this inscription has been reconstructed from another inscription, which I just showed you a little bit earlier on. But you can see it more or less repeats word for word what the other inscription says about Eumachia, and the daughter of Lucius, public priestess, etc., etc. But in this case, she wants this to be displayed in front of everyone that's arriving in the forum area. So it's clearly that she wants people to know that she was involved, not just in the building of this, but also probably trying to push forward her son, Marcus Nuceria Fronto, as being an important player within society. We are very much looking at a patriarchal society, but even still, she wants to emphasize the point that she is a public priestess and that she has built this for her son. So clearly, this is an important individual, and she wants to emphasize that. She's not the only one that's involved in sort of building, shall we say, pillars in the forum. We also have this one here for Popitus. But in this case, this is in 89 BC, so it's quite early. But you can see in comparison to what is a striking inscription, this one is sort of quite small and insignificant in comparison to what Eumachia has done. So this is commemorating what he's done, but certainly Eumachia wants everyone to see what she's done, not just in terms of looking at columns, but a whole building behind. And this inscription comes from the front of the basilica area, but again, just to re-emphasize the point, looking at the inscriptions and the effort that's been put in to display, you can see what Eumachia has done is certainly more significant and more impressive. And this is just giving you an indication as to how close the basilica is to the Eumachia building. There is another interesting temple, which is this temple to there's a bit of discussion as to what this temple actually is, but I'm putting it to the lineage of Augustus, the genus of Augustus. Sometimes it's been described as being the temple of Vespasian, or sometimes the temple of the sort of genus of Pompeii. But what's important about this is it's another female individual that puts this up. And her name, Mamea, daughter of Publius, she is also a public priestess. And like Eumachia, she set up this building on her own land at her own expense. And she's spelling this out. Now, admittedly, there's a little bit of controversy in terms of how we interpret this, but I think is significant is the fact that this is a female who's expressing herself as the public priestess, is taking over some of the land quite close to the forum area and building a structure. And she wants to promote herself as being the individual who sets it up. Now, this inscription is found somewhere inside this structure, but is nothing like what we see in terms of the Eumachia building. And this is what it looks like from the outside. It doesn't seem to be as impressive. There would have been a colonnade in front of this too, but certainly it's not as striking as what we see in terms of the Eumachia building. Looking inside the building is you can see this clearly a religious structure. You can see the sort of cella, the sort of shrine behind, but in front of that you've got your altar. The altar is decorated. Normally public worship in Roman temples were in the front of it, and this is where the altar is here. You can have a look at the decoration surrounding area. But it clearly does look like a religious building, which is very different when we talk about looking at the Eumachia building. Just an indication of public worship taking place here. You can see it's very male dominated, which is interesting. As I said, there's been a female priestess looking at this. Again, sort of old paintings, which I quite like, so I just threw that one in. And this one here again, because it's going back to the Second World War. So 1944, we can see American airmen sort of surrounding and visiting Pompeii. So to try and make the point and illustrate the point in relation to the scale, we can see the temple set up by Mamea is much smaller than that that's been set up by Eumachia. But still, there are two female individuals that have taken over this large part or this large section of the forum area. And clearly these individuals, again, just trying to illustrate, the scale of it, did want to see or display themselves as being patrons of the town. Unfortunately, we were a little bit of discussion in terms or debate as to the dating of the respective structures, but it's possibly the Eumachia building slightly later. But the point is, these are two female individuals that are, as I said, displaying their donations and their sponsorship of buildings and dedications to Pompeii as a town. Moving away from the females, And another interesting structure, which you'll hopefully see why I've concluded this one. This is not in the forum area, it's a little bit further on, but this is the temple to Fortuna Augusta. And this is set up by a gentleman called Marcus Tullius. And there's an inscription that's been included in relation to that, but you can see it also refers to this temple itself has been set up on his own land and at his own expense. So it has, again, another person who's dedicated private land and put it into the public area. Now, he didn't just leave everything over it. He has this little one, which I've probably passed it a number of times and never even noticed it. But if you could just sort of squint your eyes and use your imagination and just pretend that you can actually see the writing here. But part of this area is still in private hands, and he wants to mention that.
Hello.
The picture over there to
Hello.
the left-hand
How's
side
my?
is
Hello. I'll go into another room because I can't
this is another this is
mute my computer.
Marcus Tullius himself and a statue of him over there towards the left. And just to give you an indication of its proximity, this is the temple itself. You can see it's a bit away from the forum area itself, which is over there towards the left, and the Eumachia building there to the right, or I should say to the right. So in terms of the proximity to each other, you can see they're all quite close in terms of that sort of religious aspect I've already told you about. Look, the Temple of Venus there as well. So getting back into the Eumachia building, now I said to you that it's very impressive when we look at the front of it, the frontal inscription, front of the pillars in front of it and the inscription above them. So why I mentioned about the Porto Marina a little bit earlier on is because one of the means to get into Pompeii is from that gate, and this is where quite a number of people, particularly those who are coming from the sea, would enter into it. So as they moved in up and past the basilica, they would have passed, or at least would have seen the back of the Temple of Venus. The most striking thing they would have seen as they entered into the forum is going to be the Eumachia building, the facade of the Eumachia building, but also the inscription above the pillars. So that's what they would have seen as they approached into the area. And this is moving in from the Porta Marina, the areas. And just to give you an impression of that, the Eumachia building is like exactly in front. You can see the road sort of widens out slightly in relation to that. So certainly the Eumachia building would have been very striking for them. Now this, older image was a little bit better than some of the earlier images I found of it. Current images I found is in 1874. You can see what they've done. They've reconstructed, put up some of the pillars again, which sort of does slightly obstruct the views, but that's one of the points I want to make a little bit later on. The other approach road that we get into the forum area is the Via della Abbondanza, which is again another important sort of circulatory street into it, and the Eumachia building is over on the right-hand side. But even still, on the right-hand side, the Eumachia building and the facade of itself is quite dominant. But once they got into the forum area itself, the Eumachia building is significant. A further street, which is a sort of secondary street, but I still think it's important because it's one of the ways in which people would have entered into the forum area is from the south. And if we again moving up to the top of that, you can see the row of columns which are there and part of the Eumachia building. In other words, the pathway itself, in some ways, is part of incorporated into part of the Eumachia building. It's obstructing sort of some of the walkway into the forum area. And taking it from going further north into it, still the Eumachia building, I think, the facade, the inscription of it would have drawn attention to this building within the forum of Pompeii. So looking at that, but now that I've said that, and the point about the pillars that I'm making to you is, although as an individual in modern day society entering into the forum, particularly from the Via Marina, it would have been obstructed until you get into the actual forum area itself. But once you get into the forum area, you would have been very impressed with the northern part of it, which is the temple of Jupiter. But certainly because of the inscription above the pillars in front of the Eumachia building, attention would have been drawn to that. So regardless, I think the Eumachia building is still going to be significant, but we do need to try and put it into the contemporary setting that we would have had a completely colonnaded forum area. So moving into the Eumachia building itself, or at least temporarily moving into the Eumachia building, there are three aspects to the Eumachia building. The first part is the colonnade, which I've sort of talked a little bit about that and talked about the inscriptions above the pillars. It's also there's another part of a crypt and a portico, but I'll talk about those in each in turn. What I want to do is focus upon the colonnade aspect initially. The colonnaded aspect is this area. So as I said, the inscription's in the front area, but I want to move in a little bit closer into the structure itself. You can see it is quite a large and substantial space. Excuse me. And also it's sort of set back slightly from the other building that I've just said to you, the one that might have been the temple of the Genus of Augustus or something like that. It does seem to almost have its own separate area, its own sort of separate public area between the building behind, the Eumachia building behind, but also the forum area itself. Again, just trying to illustrate that point. And you can see again, as you're just walking down from the north, down from the northern part, and you can turning left, you can still there is a substantial space. If you look down, you can see just beyond that the Via de Abundanza, where you can see the sort of white marble at the bottom part. Now I'm just seeing it myself. You can see there's still a wall there that shows that this is almost like a self-contained area, and it was to some extent a self-contained area, and there were barriers that could have been used to block off this area, not preventing people from really getting into it, but at least sort of segregating it to some extent, which suggests that there's some sort of activities that are taking place within this area that they want to not necessarily exclude, but separate, but would have been visible for the public to see. So what was going on in this space? And again, when you go in there in a modern day, it's very easy to miss. But if you look towards the left, you can see a sort of row of blocks. And what are those row of blocks? Again, they're sort of trying to illustrate this in terms of that sort of separate area, the row of blocks there under the columns. So these would have been to support statues. So this area itself is not just some sort of activity, but also seems to be an area with various statues have been set up. Now these statues are not obviously facing into the forum area because they're in front of the columns, but obviously facing into this area, the Chalcidium of the Eumachia building, which she has provided finances for this particular area. Again, just trying to give you a good illustration as to what that. Unfortunately, because the result of the earthquake, it says there's about 17 of these bases. We don't really know what these statues would have been placed here. An older image here, that's just before they put the pillars back up. It's an indication of that. Again, one of those sort of slight mysteries that you find when you're starting to dig into things. When I talk to you about the inscription that's in front of, on top of these pillars, there was also done in black writing, clear black writing in large text, another further, not sort of inscription, but writing. And this has been interpreted as this, which refers to Eumachia, daughter of Lucius, public priestess, and several other individuals. Unfortunately, the notebooks recording this aren't specific enough, and even the person who's writing this in terms of the corpus, there's doubts about the interpretation of it, but still thought it was interesting that would highlight this as referring to public priestesses. Now, as this refers to Eumachia in the nominative, it would suggest that she put this up, and it's possible that these other female characters put this up. So possibly some of those statue bases might have been to female public priestesses of Pompeii, perhaps. But as I said to you, there's this is not something that really gets tends to discuss much in terms of the archaeological reports in relation to the Eumachia building, but still I thought it was something interesting that would possibly suggest in relation to that. So as I said to you, this was found behind this inscription area here. The further interpretation of this is that maybe it was redundant, that it was supposed to be something else, but certainly we don't really know whether this was something that people just didn't follow through in terms of putting an inscription, but certainly Eumachia wants to have this inscription in the front part, but what was going on the back bit, I don't know. So following through in relation to what might have been taking place in this sort of area in front of the Eumachia building, this structure was found, which is a herm. Traditionally, there would have been a portrait on top of this or a bust on top of it, which has been lost. But this refers to an individual that was an actor and refers to him as playing minor parts. From reading into it a little bit, it suggests that this is a person that was a close companion to Sulla, but this has been set up, as it says here, about the suburban council. I'm not sure exactly what that was, but this has been set up by town councillors from Pompeii in this particular area. So this would suggest that possibly these statue bases, following through on what I've been suggesting a little bit earlier on about the public priestesses, this was an area that was done for important individuals that are coming from the area of Pompeii. So that's possibly what these statues were for, or these bases were for people, important, prominent individuals that have done something in Pompeii. And it's interesting that they've been possibly put there in relation to the area of Eumachia building. Now, of course, I should put a little bit of proviso there, is that there's been quite a number of fragments and bits of marble been found in this area, and it might have been this area, as I already said to you, would have been a useful space for the gatherings of people. It was also possibly a useful space for the gatherings of aspects of sculpture when they're trying to repair areas in the forum area and the adjacent buildings. So it's something we do need to be a little bit careful about when we're looking at these sort of various fragments. And again, that's something I'll talk about a little bit later on about how statues move around quite a bit. So this is a bit of a reconstruction of the front of the Eumachia building beyond the pillars I've just talked to you about. And I'm going to talk about these areas here. And that's located in these areas. So it's two flanking elements of the area of the front or the facade of the Eumachia building. So looking at the area to the left, you can see there's a doorway. And there's a doorway that has sort of stairs or a little bit of a ramp into it, and a platform in the front. So if you're looking at the illustration there, this is the top part of the doorway. On the left hand side, if you're looking towards the right, you can see where the lighting at least allows you to show that you could go up the doorway and into this podium area. So this is an area that would have been used for some form of, I suppose, display, so to speak, or at least a podium in which a person could stand and talk to a group of individuals, somewhat similar to what you can see in certain sort of temple sites. Now, this has been led to the idea that what was taking place was this was for the sale of slaves, and the individual who was selling the slaves would have been sort of auctioning them off in this particular area itself. Now, whether that's true or not, I'm sort of have a little bit dubious in relation to that, but it could also have been related to other functionals that could have been to do with buying and selling. Some other auctions could be dealing with cloth or whatever, but there is some sort of could be a commercial activity, but at the same time we shouldn't necessarily negate the aspect that there might have been some sort of ritualistic aspect in terms of maybe there was some sort of ceremonies that took place. Moving from the left hand side over to the right hand side, there does seem to be a repeat structure. But what is interesting in relation to that, in some ways, I think sort of reduce a little bit about the functional element onto the left aspect, is that you could imagine there could sort of be two competing elements that are taking place, but this is a false area. So although it's a doorway onto the right hand side, it doesn't allow you to get into the podium area. So what the people who are designing this were trying to do is at least create balance between the two areas. So although I do think there would have been activities taking place, certainly most of the activities would be taking place on the left-hand side rather than the right-hand side, but which is more concerned about balance. So you will also see that these sort of indents in the wall itself would have been for a statuary. Unfortunately, we don't know what's there taking place on the left-hand side. The bit in the middle, the sort of circular area, we do know there has been fragments of marble has been preserved, so it would have been very pretty and very nice in relation to that. Um, and you can see some of the fragments over here. But in the doorway, between the doorway, flanking the doorway, are two different alcoves. Again, these would have been for statues, but at least in this case, we have a better idea as to what might have been placed here. And you can see there's a reconstruction of, or quite a bad reconstruction actually, of an inscription that has been thought to have been preserved from there. If you just look over to the one on the right hand side, which has been preserved over, I think it's in Rome actually rather than Pompeii, you might see the reference to the word Romulus. And this refers to Romulus and what the great things that Romulus did. And it has been suggested this is an exact copy of an inscription that was placed underneath the statue of Romulus in the Forum of Augustus that was inaugurated in 2 BC. So this is starting to suggest there are connections between the Eumachia building in terms of Eumachia as a patroness is trying to promote or follow through on sort of Augustan ideals. So as I was saying to you, this is an inscription that's supposed to have been found part of in the Forum of Augustus. Now, whether this is an exact copy from what took place in the city of Rome, I have slight doubts, but certainly we know there would have been an inscription. But I know scholars have said that is the case. I've also seen scholars talk about reconstructing the inscriptions under the statue of Romulus in the Forum of Augustus from Pompeii. So in some ways, a little bit of a pushing and pulling between these sort of two interpretations, something I need to look into a little bit more closely. But this does make that implicit link to Romulus. On the right-hand side, we have another inscription, and in this case, more partial, but this is referring to Aeneas. Now, Romulus and Aeneas are important players in relation to that sort of Augustan ideology, and certainly Aeneas, the son of Venus, was seen as one of the ancient ancestors of Augustus. Now, this seems to be a little bit of a sort of going a little bit askew, but we can see in this household that's on the Via della Badanza, just trying to sort of make the point as to what the statues might have looked like. I've have a close up. Flanking this doorway, which might be a copy of what they had seen on the Eumachia building, we have Romulus on the left-hand side, and you have Aeneas on the right-hand side. So bringing that into what we see in the area of the Chalcidium in front of the Eumachia building, I already mentioned to you, possibly on the left-hand side, the statues here with important figures from Pompeian society. But on the right-hand side, we have on either side of the doorway Romulus and Remus, but further, the other two alcoves we don't know, but perhaps they were part of the Augustan family. Perhaps Tiberius and his brother Drusus. Possibly, we just don't know, but maybe the left-hand side was for Pompeian significant individuals, while on the right-hand side for imperial significant individuals connected to the Augustan period. So moving away from the Chalcidium area, but again trying to show that this was an important area in terms of different types of activity, and looking at further the exterior part of the Eumachia building and moving down the Via del Badanza, which will take you down ultimately to the amphitheatre, you can see that it's very much dominates this streetscape. There's no break in terms of the wall, in terms of domestic building or commercial structures until the very end. Again, just trying to, you can see that in some ways you see the blocking of the street there would have been for pedestrians only. This is a reconstruction of it. But the point I suppose I want to make in relation to this is that not only did Eumachia buy up this area, she would have had to, not herself personally, had to backfill the area to raise this up so it's on a level platform with the forum area. So it's not just that she's buying it, she really is not completely changing the topology of the area, because this is backfill that's taking place. The only part that sort of breaks in relation to this southern part of the Eumachia building is these two doorways, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. But looking at the back of the Eumachia building, again, you can see that decoration I've already suggested to you along the Via de Abbastanza follows through in relation to that. You can see the curved area and also the triangular areas. This is quite nice in terms of a reconstruction of it, so it makes it very clear as to what has been lost. And a reconstruction of it, again, you can see this is looking at the back area that I've just been telling you about. Again, you can see how the slope of the land, they've had to try and evolve the building in relation to that. The point why I'm trying to show you about the facade is it's almost an exact copy of what we see in the interior of the Temple of Augustus that I've already showed you a little bit earlier on, which is a religious building. So it seems to be copying and mimicking that aspect. Moving up from one of the streets that's going into the side of the Eumachia building, it's where you see this sort of side street. There's been no effort to try and cover up to follow through in the decoration. But why I wanted to point this one out, you can see just where the arrow is pointing, there's a doorway there. This is where the inscription of Lucius Eumachius Facius was found. So I thought quite interesting showing the close proximity of this. Whether the inscription is connected again, I don't know. And you can see that really is sort of quite a bit of an abandoned space. So moving to these sort of open areas I showed you in the corner in the sort of southeastern part of the Eumachia building. On the left-hand side, we've got a shop, and over on the right-hand side is a way into the Eumachia building and a fountain area in the front. Some of you who've attended talks about from before know I'm interested in shops, but this has been interpreted as a shop area. And what I quite like about this, it has a wide open area, traditional sort of shop area, but also on the right hand side, there is an exit that you can get straight into the Eumachia building. So sort of two entrances in it. So this gives a better indication as to how close this shop was, not just to dealing with people walking up and down the Via del Badanza, but also as a way to people coming into or going out of the Eumachia building would have been able to take advantage of the facilities that might have been within this, what we has been interpreted as being a shop building. And this one of the older images again just gives you a better indication. You have the steps and the slope going up to the Eumachia building, but I suppose further emphasize the point I've said to you about how much of this land had to be filled up to make that level playing area in the Eumachia structure itself. So now you can see the original inscription that I showed you at the very beginning. So this inscription has been used to fully reconstruct the inscription that is in the front area. Clearly, Eumachia wanted any entrances going into the Eumachia building to display and commemorate her benefaction that she's given to the people of Pompeii. So what I think is significant and interesting about this, going back to the point I said to you about the scale of the lettering over the pillars in the forum area itself are all the same size. But in this case, you can see that what she wants people to really see is her name, who she was in terms of her relatives beforehand, that she's a public priestess. She puts this up on her own name. Even her son's name is much smaller in relation to that. Now, whether that is significant or not, in terms of what she was trying to do, but I certainly think this is something that she is trying to emphasize her role, and very much doing that in a secondary entrance into the Eumachia building. Further interesting bit is that's the inscription that's been used as a reuse, and this is the back end of that inscription. So she's trying to, or people who put this up for her, are reusing the marble stone. Marble itself is a rare material. But it certainly is a key area that's been showing about the austerity and the display in which she's doing. Again, a further reconstruction of that, but in this case, you can see, what the shop area, the entrance into it, but the ornate facade of the Eumachia building in terms of the rear and the southern side. There has been an effort to, decorate this, and this is a part of the display of the importance and significance of this building. When we're moving into the front of it, what's often impressive is the fascia, or the side elements of the doorway into the Eumachia building. Unfortunately, when you see that now today, it's covered in see-through plastic, which is obviously suffered from light, so not necessarily all that clear. But already, even looking at this in the lower parts, or maybe in the right-hand side, you can see the intricacy of the inscription on the sides of the door frame. That's the word I was looking for, door frame. Looking at it a little bit more closely, you can see the ornate vegetation. If you're looking at it even more closely, you can see, particularly looking at the left-hand side, there's a little bird up there, another bird further down to the southern part, the lower part. In this case, we have a little rabbit. What the rabbit's doing, I don't know. Obviously, a very small one. There's a giant snail. So it's not just intricate in terms of looking at vegetation, but in terms of looking at little animals and stuff like that. So it's very intricate and very ornate. So again, wealth has been put into this. Why would you do this unless you're trying to do a very strong display of her importance and significance within that Roman site? In this case, we have a hare, as opposed to a rabbit, or maybe it's a rabbit, I don't know. And another one of a snail. You can see in this one there's a little bird playing with eating grapes, that's the word. So very intricate, and these two birds sort of fighting with each other over the tops of these flowers. So where might some of the idea in relation to this have come from? The inspiration could be the Areopagus Augustus that was consecrated in 9 BC, which is an altar that was set up by the Senate to commemorate Augustus' safe return from the area of Gaul and Spain. And if we look closely at the decoration in relation to that, you can see the vegetation and again various animals that are on display here. So possibly this area out on the surrounding area of the doorway was inspired by Augustan ideology in terms of display, but taking that into Pompeii. There is a little bit of a proviso I'd add into that, is if we look at some of the older images of it, you can see that the door frame isn't there. So it's possible the door frame didn't necessarily belong to the building, but certainly as it is now, it does seem to be the suggestion that it did belong to it, but there is an also possibility that it belonged to the adjacent building that I've already said to you that Mamaea might have set up, but that's again something that's open to debate. The suggestion is it doesn't fit quite right, but as you see it nowadays, as far as most scholarship will talk about, it does belong to Eumachia building. So moving away, I talked a little bit about the Chalcidium. I'm going to move into the portico area and moving into the actual building of Eumachia. So I'm moving through the doorway and we have this wide open space. Now, of course, a lot of this has been lost. This would have been an open courtyard area that would have been surrounded by columns, but in front of that you can see a podium that clearly was there for a significant statue in some shape or form. There would have been a pathway around. This would have been covered over, as I said to you, by the columns and a sort of roofed area above that. And this is just giving a bit of a view over to the left-hand side of where there must have been some sort of statue. So there was clearly a significant focal statue that was placed in the center. There's also two sort of niches on either side of that, which would again be from some form of statue, but we don't necessarily know. Now, something I didn't really talk about a little bit early on is that this is a column, this is a building that's been dedicated by Eumachia to Concordia. Concordia has been associated with sort of harmony, and harmony in particular in relation to the Augustan family and the wider empire. So that again sort of further emphasized that element, or that Augustan connection, or the imperial family connection that Eumachia is trying to make a connection to. Now, in the actual area itself, this charming statue was found, and this statue has been interpreted as being Concordia or Fortuna. She does seem to be a connection that's a statue is connected to sort of fruitfulness. We can see that what she's carrying on her her right hand, her left arm is a cornucopia of plenty. Now, because of peace and everything within the empire itself, that it's now a time of prosperity and wealth. Now, this is the original excavation report and it's translated into English from 1818. And you can see the statue itself, head was missing. Part of the cornucopia, the horn of plenty, was also missing, but that was eventually found. I think the right arm might have been sort of reconstruction of that. But what I wanted to point out in relation to this is because we're looking at the statue, it's beautiful marble statue in a white color was painted, and sees part of the edges of this was a golden color. And again, it talks about later, a few days later on, about the golden aspect of the statue itself. So part of that sort of decoration itself, unfortunately, has been lost. One of the things I did find slightly distressing about it was referred to as sort of second-rate statue. So if it was a second-rate statue, what does this suggest about it, being part of that sort of focal point within the Eumachia building itself? Now, as I said to you, the upper part of the cornucopia was lost, and that explains the sort of darker colour as it reattached. Now, certainly, I think it looks like an impressive statue. When you go to the Naples Museum, it does look impressive, and certainly when I viewed it. But I want you to start thinking a little bit about that secondary aspect. So when we're looking at the face of the Eumachia, not the Eumachia, the Concordia, it's often suggested trying to develop that connection with Augustus a little bit further on. And in terms of Concordia, one of the individuals been connected with Concordia is Livia Drusius, or Drusilla, which is the wife of Augustus. And she is often sometimes depicted as being Livia Concordia. So here's a variety of statues. The one on the left hand is coming from Berlin, the one in the middle from the Louvre, another one in Copenhagen. And looking at the facial features there, it has been suggested this is actually Livia Drusilla. So possibly the inspiration for the Concordia statue in Pompeii comes from Livia Drusilla. Now, I don't know how you feel when you're looking at the faces here. They all look fairly similar to me. So I have a bit of a doubt as to whether you can actually identify figures from just looking at the facial features, particularly female characters or female statues. So possibly she might have been the dominant statue, the statue of Concordia in the podium area over there on the right hand side, or she might have been a secondary statue over in this, suggesting this area slightly over to the left, which is the center of this image here. So there could have been a statue of Concordia Livia that would have been the focal point, as opposed to this Concordia statue. But again, it's open to interpretation. We unfortunately don't have a statue that was actually found in situ. But this is a reconstruction of what this area might have looked like. In terms of looking at it from the front entrance to the back where the statue would have been placed. Further statuary existed, and this is looking from the reverse area from the statue, looking outwards into it. Again, you can see these niches that must have been placed of statues. Possibly these statues would have had other connections with the imperial family to some extent we don't know. It might have been aspects in relation to significant players within Pompeii, we just don't know. But if this is dedicated to Concordia and the sort of Augustan Concordia, I would suggest it probably is something to do with sort of imperial statuary of some shape or form. But it would again have been an ornate space. And when we look at it nowadays, we do see that as sort of quite a quiet space. And this is brought about as what is this space actually used for? When it was originally excavated, there were some not baths, but sort of basins were found in this area, and has led to the suggestion that it might have been connected to wool working and things like that. And it might have been a market space. However, it's more than likely that these basins would not have been anything to do with sort of commercial activity, would have been part of helping to been part of the reconstruction of the Eumachia building, because even after the earthquake of 62, it doesn't seem this building had gone back into full use, even after a long period of time between that and 79 AD when the eruption of Vesuvius takes place. Another reconstruction of that, again, this moving away from the statue looking out towards the forum area, reconstruction of what this might have looked like and how it might have looked like in terms of from the colonnade, from looking out from the colonnade. Certainly would have been impressive and beautiful structure itself. Now, this reconstruction itself, it sort of shows that there was 2 layers into it, which would have made it much more impressive. This is an older reconstruction, which just has a single layer into it. But again, it just shows about, how much interpretation is involved when we're looking at these structures. Even if it was a single structure, it would have been an impressive space. But as I said to you, what the use of this space is still open to much interpretation. Moving into the sort of final space, this sort of crypt area, which is a little bit more difficult sort of highlight in my skills in terms of using PowerPoint. So I'm just putting the arrows areas here. So this is an area just around the outskirts of the building itself. There's only sort of 2 entrances into it from the front, from either side. And even sort of nowadays, it can be still quite difficult into getting into it. This could have been shut off from the rest of the portico area by shutters. So this space could have been, and I think if you're looking at Vitruvius, the suggestion is that this area was shut off in sort of bad weather so that people could carry out various different activities, possibly commercial activities in these sort of side areas. A reconstruction of that, which then gives you an indication as to, the play of light, but it does give the impression that this could have been a significant and separate area from the central area of the Eumachia building, the porticus area of the Eumachia building. So moving further down into this, and this is perhaps the most important and significant area of this building for the simple reason of this statue. But this statue is at the end and the rear of the building. And you might see from the inscription just below the statue, the name Eumachia appears. So this is a further connection between the inscription in the front, Eumachia in the front, and Eumachia here in the back of the building. And this is a statue which is reputed to be Eumachia herself. And there's an old image of it. You can see the decoration that unfortunately much of it has been lost, but at least some of it has been preserved in from even nowadays, but you can see the vividness of the colors, which everything would have been lost itself, and a reconstruction of that. So this statue itself is, I think, interesting and significant in its located exactly to the back. Obviously, it's separated from it. What would have been the central statue in the porticus area of it. So whoever set up this statue are sort of trying to make that sort of subtle connection between Eumachia and the individual that would have been displayed, whether it's the Concordia statue I showed you or a statue of Livia. The statue itself, again, it's a reconstruction that you see in Pompeii, and certainly if you go and see it in the Naples Museum, you can see it's a very beautiful statue. You can see the hair coloration is still existing, but this is a female individual that seems to be shown and displayed as a priestess, which would follow through on her position as being a public priestess. She is displayed beside the statue of Concordia, but you can see it's quite a bit smaller than the Concordia statue. So although I mentioned to you a little bit earlier on that the Concordia statue was rated as being, when originally excavated, in a second-rate statue, I think both of them look, very impressive to me. I certainly think the Eumachia statue itself is very beautiful. And this again, trying to just look a little bit of a close-up of the 2 individuals, but you can see there's not much of a difference in terms of facial features. So if we're playing around with that idea about this, the Concordia statue on the right-hand side being an image of Livia, Eumachia also looks a little bit like Livia. So perhaps the suggestion is that she's following through on this idea of trying to show herself as a public priestess, a major player within Pompeii, but also following through on that sort of Augustan ideology. But again, I do think that this is not an exact image of what Eumachia actually looks like. It's showing what she wanted to express, or what female statues being expressed as, that priestess, a matronly sort of figure, that sort of thing. It's not, and there isn't the effort to try and show a like for like image, but certainly it is a significant statue in itself. The inscription itself is not in the nominative, it's in the dative, so she didn't set this up. And if you follow through on the inscription itself, it shows that this is Eumachia, talking about who her father was, refers to the position that she was a public priestess, and this has been set up by fullers. The fullers are sort of cloth workers within Pompeian society. And this has led to the suggestion that Eumachia might have been a patroness or patron of cloth workers in Pompeii, and they wanted to sort of say, thank you very much for all that you've done, and put up the statue. We don't know if that's true, but certainly the Fullers have at least paid for this inscription and possibly also this statue. So it's not Eumachia that set up this statue for herself. So this is possibly something that was set up a little bit later on. But again, trying to fit that into the chronology of the building itself is still quite difficult and quite complex. And this has led further to the suggestion I mentioned to you a little bit earlier on that the building itself might have been sort of a mercantile area for cloth working that was taking place, or some sort of connections in relation to that cloth working. But again, I said we don't know. So Eumachia is not the only female individual that has a statue that's set up. And this is moving on to another important family, which I think I might end up doing a talk about this next year, the Halconi family. And moving away from the Eumachia building, moving down the Via de Abbondanza, takes us into this area, sort of a sort of triangular area on the Via de Abbondanza. You can see on the left-hand side there's a statue base. Again, playing around with Google Earth, you can see how the streetscape does sort of change. And there was an arch that was set up here, a four-sided arch, which was and had columns there, and each of these columns seemed to have had a statue base. Now, the front statue base on the left-hand side has been set up to Marcus Halconius Rufus, which is an important individual, a person who's involved in the reconstruction development of the theatre buildings. But behind him, there was a statue of Halconia, and she herself, unfortunately, the inscription has been removed, refers to herself as being or not she's referring to, but the setup to her in terms of who her father was, but she was also a public priestess. Now, this again was something that frustrated me a little bit, in that sometimes I read that there was a statue of Halconia, and it took a while to find it. And this is the statue that's sometimes attributed to being Halconia. Now, if you might have remembered, I've already showed you this statue, particularly the statue, it's all the same statue on the left-hand side, and referred to her as being Livia. So there some scholars have interpreted this statue as being not just Livia, but also Halconia. The place in which this statue was found was not that area of the streetscape, but was found in the Marcellum, which is the market area of Pompeii. This is the statues over to the left-hand side. Now, what we see on the right-hand side is a reconstruction. Unfortunately, her arms were lost, but they've been reconstructed. So this is why I was saying to you a little bit earlier on, we do need to be a little bit careful about, when we're putting labels onto these particular statues. But certainly, she's been displaying herself as a priestess. And I've already talked to you about even the Eumachia building a statue herself is sometimes has been linked into, has been connected to Livia. We have a statue here that's been found in the Villa of the Mysteries, which is just outside Pompeii. And in this case, the statue itself, the face itself has been lost, has been replaced with what has been suggested to be Livia. Now, the original statue might have been the lead female within the household, but for some reason it's been replaced with Livia. But I think this whole idea of making sure connecting every female statue we found to Livia is taking things a little bit too far. And we can see that when we're looking at these further statues, all of these being connected to being Livia all seem to be not just similar to what I said to you about Concordia. Maybe it's just I'm not as refined as some other people, but can also seem to be very similar to looking at the facial features that we see of Eumachia. Now, I'm trying to push completely away from the idea that this is an image of Livia, but might be just sort of a generic female individual, an important female individual, a classical style female individual, facial features. But what we see is, and we talk about maybe a connection. Do we see some other connections? This is an exterior of a shop outside Pompeii. Some of you might know this, and this is an image of Venus of Pompeii. And if you're looking at the pose and the positioning of this particular image of Venus of Pompeii, she does seem to be holding herself very similar to, and this is also on the Via dell'Abbondanza, to the statue of Eumachia. So I think there's an interesting parallel between this. So perhaps we have Eumachia, and the facial features been set up for her by the Fullers, or individuals with the Fullers as well, is trying to show Eumachia in her role as a public priestess and connection to the Venus of Pompeii. So I thought, wait, that's a great idea. And that sort of pushes away from that whole sort of Livia idea. But to go back into the image, the image over to the right hand side, if you remember, or go back to that image so you don't have to remember. We've got, the Concordia or Fortuna on the left-hand side, but you can see the Venus of Pompeii is in a chariot and is being escorted by 4 elephants. I was going to say horses, but they're not horses. Elephants. So why has Ardle included this quote, this reference to Suetonius? Now, when Augustus passed away, Livia was still an important individual, but her son got a bit bored with her a bit, Tiberius, and she was sort of pushed a little bit into the background. So it wasn't until the reign of Claudius tried to re-emphasize, I suppose, his connection to the Julio-Claudian dynasty and makes Livia into an important and prominent individual, and she becomes an important sort of icon, such that part of Claudius's ideology at the time. So part of what he was doing in sort of reinvigorating the image of Livia was during public events, particularly like amphitheater and things like that, a statue of Livia will be brought out to celebrate her being sort of back into the public light. She had passed away at this stage, and she becomes no longer Livia. She becomes Augusta. She's almost become a level of divine. I can't remember if she was divine at that stage, but clearly Augustus is trying to make that link. She's brought out in a chariot, and the chariot has been dragged out by elephants. So perhaps this image here, and I've tried to push away from the idea that it's Livia, goes back now, spiraling back into not only do we have Eumachia probably incorporating that whole idea of the Venus of Pompeii, but also of Livia, all sort of lumped in together in one figure. Further of interest, below this image, and admittedly it is a shop front, we can see cloth workers impart their daily activities in, which might make a further connection to the cloth working aspects of the Fullers, perhaps. So moving to the actual function, particularly of that central area of the Eumachia buildings, often a parallel is made to the porticus of Livia. This is an area that was set up ultimately on what became public land. It was a private land that was donated to Augustus, and Augustus set this up as the porticus of Livia, and Livia commemorated this structure with her son Tiberius, and hence the possible connection that maybe Eumachia was trying to follow through on that. So what was the purpose of this building? This building itself was an open space. It's an area in which sort of artworks would have been displayed, there's an extract here from Livy. They're talking about the sort of grapes that were grown as there, but it would have been a quiet space. So you could imagine that perhaps the Eumachia building if it's following through on that whole sort of Augustan Livia sort of connection, that this is what she was trying to follow through, not just on the sort of superficial decorative elements of the Augustan ideology, but taking that further and sort of seeing herself almost as if she is the Livia of Pompeii, but certainly a significant player in relation to that. So this sort of porticus area in the Eumachia building had nothing to do with commercial activities. One of the reasons why moving away from that sort of commercial activity, this is the Marcellum, the market in Pompeii. You can see the store area is the lower part of this image was storage area, that if it's an active market area, you do expect there to be certain areas of storage, which is absent from the Eumachia building. So hence this, why I would think that it probably was just sort of an open space, a quiet space, a space of display and thinking about the statuary in the area and perhaps the significance and the contributions that Augustus has given to the Roman Empire. This is an image of those store areas in the Marcellum. Now, you will find scholars that make comparisons between the Eumachia building on the left-hand side and the Porticus of Livia on the right-hand side, that they're different. But of course they're different. They're in different locations, they're a different scale, but even looking at a superficial level, you can see that even the Porticus of Livia has tried to sort of skew itself into the townscape of Rome, and very much what we can see in terms of the Eumachia building. So of course they are different, but at the same time, broadly, they do seem to be quite similar by just looking at the plans themselves. So this is just looking at some of the aspects of the Eumachia building itself. Now, I said to you the main entrance is coming from the front. I also mentioned about the secondary entrance, and this is where the arrow is pointing to. And you can see at the bottom of this exit, you can see the fountain that I mentioned a bit earlier on. Now, this seems perhaps a small point, but you can see looking at the the water area going into the actual basin itself, we can see an image that's very like in terms of the Concordia element of the statue that's inside. So this would perhaps show that maybe this fountain area, it's not just the building itself, but this fountain would have been set up by Eumachia because of the connection between Concordia, both interior and exterior. So it just shows possibly how much of a patroness she was of the actual town itself. Hence, you know, making that connection between Concordia displayed in the front, Livia at the back, not Livia, Eumachia at the back, and also the fountain and the area outside, possibly. Now, looking at and comparing this with other fountains in Pompeii, this seems to be the most sort of the prettiest in terms of sculpture relief on the exterior of the fountain itself. And you can see a further fountain further down the Via di Abbondanza, and this would have been obviously for public use. And again, it shows about her, I suppose, caring for a community and her donations to community. So although the Eumachia building itself displays her name, but it's given over for public use, both in the front area, the crypt area, and also the porticus area in the interior. So that's really much about what I want to say to you about the Eumachia building. So I want to return to Marcus Tullius. He set up the temple of Fortuna Augusta. What sort of reward did he get on his passing? So if we move to the area to the lower, well, in the case here, it's the bottom of it, the necropolis, the Porta Stabia, this is where he is commemorated. And there's a tomb to Marcus Tullius, and we can see the sort of sculla, the sort of circular sort of seating area. And this has been dedicated and just outside the gateway, and this is public space. This is under the control of the town council, and he couldn't just put anything there. And this seems to have been set up by the town council in commemoration of Marcus Tullius for whatever he's did. The image that we have of Marcus Tullius, as I said to you, is that temple that he set up just outside the forum area. The indication, you can just get this indication of how close it was to the town walls. Now, what we know of Marcus Tullius comes from this sort of marker area more than anything else. That this is been dedicated to him by the town council. Unfortunately, we don't have any inscriptions. We don't even know where he was buried, but the excavations suggest that there would have been some sort of funerary aspect just behind this circular area. So the town council has allowed him to be buried here, but is also commemorating this spot. It's possible that any sort of inscription itself has been lost. There's no reference to his titles, but that might have been part of the tombstone. But the scolia area itself is the significant aspect that wants to illustrate. So that's looking at male individual. What about the Eumachia building next to our neighbor, Mamiya? She also has an impressive tomb. This is just outside the Herculaneum Gate. You can just about see the circular area from this image, but this is a nice black and white one. The one there to the right-hand side, this is dedicated to her. Now this, to me, is even more impressive, and you can see the lettering here that makes reference to her in terms of her connection to her father, she's public priestess, and that this has been set up by the decree of the town council. What's interesting, and I didn't necessarily mention a little bit earlier on, I mentioned about the unusualness of Eumachia not mentioning her husband, but Amaya here also her husband isn't mentioned, and perhaps that has something to do with the fact of connections being a public priestess, that the father's more important while the husband isn't. I thought that was an interesting idea and sort of move against that idea about, her husband passing away early, and hence that's why she's pushing forward her son in terms of the public platform. But again, we don't know. A reconstruction of that, which again I thought was quite pretty. But what about Eumachia? Eumachia's tomb, just outside the Porta Nuceria, is this area here. And it is one of the largest tombs that has thus far been excavated in Pompeii. But you can see it's not close to the actual gateway. This is just a poor image, but it gives you an indication as to the size of the actual structure itself. It is flanked by two other tombs, but still, this is the statue. This is the statue. This is the tomb itself. It is the largest, as I said to you, that's been found in Pompeii. It's not been set up by the public authorities, and it's unusual for various different reasons. Just over there on the bottom side, you can see sort of a white rectangle, and this has the name Eumachia on it. On the right-hand side again, another white bit, and this is what it refers to. This is the full inscription of both of them together about Eumachia, who she's a daughter of. She sets this up for herself and hers. That's it. That is the only connection that we have to Eumachia. This was excavated in 1954, so quite a lot later than the Eumachia building. But it is interesting, as I said, most people, individuals we know from Pompeii, most of the details come from inscriptions. There's nothing from their tombstone or their tomb area. There's nothing in relation to Eumachia's achievements. There's no reference to her as being a public priestess or any sort of family connections, which is quite interesting. It's sometimes suggested that she's been sort of put in there in a sort of area of freed individuals, but on the right-hand side or the left-hand side, it suggests that this is a tomb to a magistrate. We don't know. And the tomb over on the right-hand side itself, again, seems to be significant individuals, but are not freed individuals. The Scolia one, which is the sort of seating area, perhaps that's been somewhat, Eumachia might be one to make sure that she does, if she's not going to get this public dedication, she's going to recreate to some extent that sort of circular scolia area in her actual tomb that she's paid for herself. This is the upper part of it. You can get into it. Well, you can't get into it. It's locked up, but it's a significant structure in terms of architectural aspects. Much of it, unfortunately, has been lost, but just beside this is various statues that are found in the area. Perhaps some of these statues might belong to the Eumachia tomb, but unfortunately we don't know. This is a reconstruction of what it might have looked like. It is sort of very unique structure, as it said. Decoration that's been found is fairly limited, like door frame of the Eumachia building. It seems to be referring, it's sort of like a not decoration, like sort of there's nothing that shows any connection to Eumachia and her life, vegetation, things like. There is a suggestion that it might have been an Amazonia, which is perhaps might be linking into her sort of Greek connections, but there's nothing that has been found from the site itself that shows any connection of what she was like as an individual. So again, this sort of brings in sort of some interesting aspects about, well, what about inside the tomb itself? There's only this interesting tombstones found inside. I think there's 16 sort of alcoves in which things could have been slotted in terms of burials, cremations. This refers to Lucius Eumachius Aprilis, age 20, and the cogname here suggests that it might have been a freed individual. There's nothing in here in the tomb that connects to Eumachia as an individual. There are three other ones, but none of these refer to anyone that's connected to the Eumachi genus, and they all refer to the alii. So it looks like these individuals or this family or this genus seems to have taken over the actual tombstone of the tomb of Eumachia. So how can we interpret that? And this is where some of the difficulties come into it. Now, as I said to you, all the decoration is limited to sort of non-life aspects. There's no reference or inscription that refers to her as a priestess. So perhaps Eumachia, when she built this tomb, felt it wasn't necessary to have an inscription. The important thing that she wanted to be commemorated for was the Eumachia building in the town centre, and that was the focus, and that was what was important. But it still seemed to be a little bit of an odd sort of way of approaching things. Maybe that's what she felt, but maybe she also felt in some aspect because she's built this ornate tomb onto herself, she may have been pushed aside in terms of being an elite family within Pompeii, despite all the things that she's gifted to Pompeii. So I've been sort of beginning to push towards the idea that maybe Eumachia sort of sort of lost favor in some ways in Pompeian society. She's done these great things, but maybe because the great things that she did wasn't necessarily connected to religious activities, was more public activities. She wasn't commemorated in the same way as the likes of Mamea was, who was also a priestess. The other thing that seems to be interesting in terms of the excavation of the tomb itself, it wasn't repaired after the earthquake and seems to be in a poor state of repair generally. So perhaps some sort of tragic aspect did happen to Eumachia, and as such, not just Eumachia herself as an individual, but maybe her sort of genus itself came to some sort of tragic end. And she was the last in the line, and as such, it wasn't followed through in relation to her tomb. So, although I've been trying to push and show about how significant Eumachia is, I do sort of feel in some ways that she's been sort of hard done by in the end in terms of, how she was commemorated in terms of her tomb and that she wasn't commemorated by the town's council, but also it seems something else happened because she is not fully commemorating the front. I don't think that she would have gone against convention and not illustrate the point that she was a public priestess in her own tomb. So, thank you very much for you sitting through my talk in relation to Eumachia. Certainly an interesting character, but if you have any question, please do ask.
Excellent. Thank you, Ardle. I do have a question because I always have one.
I know,
Would,
reliant,
yes, good.
reliable, I
Would
should say.
would her public priestess role have been for a lifetime, or was it for a fixed period of time if she was voted in?
Fair question, and I have no idea. I think it must have been for a number of years. But whether it was for her lifetime once she gets elected, I don't know. I certainly think if she's illustrating the point that she was a public priestess, I think I'm guessing it would be more than 1 year. But maybe it would, because that would sort of reduce the sort of honor of the title. So I would think it would be for a number of years. But the truth is, I don't know. It's a good question.
Okay, lovely. And then in the chat box, somebody asked, was what is the bird with the crest on its head on the pillar? Which might have been the door frame. And suggested it was a peacock. And someone suggested it was a peacock and may have been signified Juno. Would you like to
Yeah,
comment on that?
Juno sometimes connected to the peacock. Very good. So
Right,
that's quite possible. But it might have just sort of a nice image. But yeah, it could be connected to Juno.
lovely. Thank you.
So they answered their own question.
Yeah, well, no, somebody else answered that.
All right.
MJF answered that, so
Oh,
thank you.
well done, you.
Does does anybody else want to unmute themselves and ask a question or put it in the chat box? Oh, hang on. Maggie is asking, do you think that Eumachia built her own tomb years before her own death?
Yeah, I would think so. And I think that's what quite a number of individuals do. So I suppose that when they get a gift from the town council, they might have moved their tomb, or they might have just had that commemoration plus their actual tomb. But yeah, I definitely think that she did a number of years before she passed away. And I suppose that's a point I didn't sort of make well enough in terms of what I was trying to say to you. In terms, I think something tragic did happen to her before she died, and as such, she wasn't. I don't think she really commemorated herself fully enough. But that's
Okay.
just my
And
theory.
yeah, that's fine. And someone has asked, Joanne's asked, who was the sculpture of the statues?
We
The
don't know.
named. You don't know, no.
Unfortunately, it's because people who are involved in, so we say, the sort of hands-on trades were not seen as sort of classy individuals. Those classy individuals were people that sort of looked at these statues. We don't really know who any of these artists would have been, but certainly they were very skilled.
Excellent. Um, someone's asked when you're next going to Pompeii.
That I don't know. I was sort of hoping to do it maybe in sort of February, but have an issue with the dog.
Oh,
So he's
oh,
getting chemotherapy, so I want to be around with him.
that's really sad. Oh no. Um, Paul has asked what happened to her son.
We don't know.
Yeah, I would
Again,
suggest he maybe died young, which is why her tomb went to rack and ruin.
well, this again, that's quite possible. We just don't know. We can only play around with the evidence we've got. Like in the next few days, make it more dramatic, an inscription could be found that tells us that what I've been saying to been all complete lies, and that she lived a happy life and she was commemorated by everybody.
Yeah. And oh, they're going off now. I've got those questions. Do you think Eumachia herself visited Rome to make the Augustan connections, or would her
Uh,
architect have done that?
Good question. Could even
Mm,
have been both. But it's interesting that although, Pompeii, not too far away from Rome by train, but certainly wouldn't be further away in ancient Roman times. So it's possible that she did, but it's also equally possible maybe her architect or designers came through. We don't know. But what we do know is that there doesn't seem to be any sort of elite from Pompeii that seems to have made it in Rome as to sort of dominant players in the Senate. But there does seem to be strong connections, but what those connections are, I don't know.
okay, lovely. Someone said you're an inspiration to us. There we go.
No, not really, but thank you.
I knew you'd hate that. Okay. No, I don't think I missed any questions. No, 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 that's it. Unless anyone wants any more questions. No, everyone's just saying thank you now. So thank you, Ardle. That was very interesting. I think you can sit on those little roundel things, can't you? On those little seats at the end there.
Oh yeah, yeah, you can, yeah. And that's
Yeah.
part of the point is that you sort of sat
Yes.
there and sort of thought about the dead people.
Yeah, I
But
think
if
I've
you
sat
think
on some
about
of
it, if
those.
you sat in the wrong place, you wouldn't know who's been commemorated.
No, that's true. No. Well, thank you very much. And thank you to everybody that joined us. We had quite a good turnout, which is excellent. And did you want to mention again who you're thinking of centering your next lecture onto?
Yeah, I was thinking about I might do the Holconi family. So make it into sort of more personal. So moving away from a woman of Pompeii, maybe a family of Pompeii.
That would be fabulous. Okay, so we are thinking of putting that on in the spring, and obviously we'll advertise it once we've got some dates. So thank you very much, Ardle. Thank you to everybody for coming up. And I say we'll hopefully get the lecture up on our YouTube channel in the new year, and you'll be able to rewatch it. So thank you, everyone.
Great.
Thank you.
Again, thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you. Bye bye.